Have you ever felt left out in a group of students of your age, interests, or different backgrounds? Have you ever felt pressurized around your peers who smoke or the ones who score perfect grades? Have you ever felt that urge to speak up in a hall against hundreds of students but cannot because you know why? Or you would have definitely felt odd when the majority of students give the same answer but you don't, and then we question our sanity. We do, right? Well, some of us may would have gone through these experiences, some don't. But let's go with the majority and understand the reason behind this behavior. At about age 7, during the celebration of the Jewish Passover, a cup of wine was placed at an empty spot at the table. A curious child was told that the wine was for the prophet Elijah. According to his uncle, the prophet visited each Jewish home on the Passover and would take a sip of wine from the cup left out for him. Fascinated, the boy kept watching the cup, and although the level of the wine never declined, there came a point when it seemed to him that perhaps it did go down a little. Any guesses who was that young curious child? That young curious child was Solomon Asch. In this video, we will learn about Solomon Asch line experiment and conformity. Solomon Elliot Asch was born on September 14, 1907 in Warsaw, Poland. He was raised in the small neighboring town of Lowicz in a large Jewish family. Asch described his childhood as a time of great anxieties, big fears, grave dangers. As a boy, Asch was naturally shy and introverted. In 1920, his family migrated to the United States, where he struggled to fit in at first due to language barriers. He eventually mastered the English language through extensive reading of Charles Dickens' novels. He became interested in psychology towards the end of his undergraduate career after reading the work of William James and a few philosophers. However, his knowledge of psychology was quite limited. Some of his initial assumptions about the field were also incorrect, and in his own words, one could almost say that he came into psychology by mistake. Despite his limited knowledge of the field, Asch went on to pursue graduate studies in psychology at Columbia University. Asch was exposed to Gestalt psychology through Gardner Murphy. He was then a young faculty member at Columbia. He became much more interested in Gestalt psychology after meeting and working closely with his advisor at Columbia, Max Wertheimer, one of the founders of Gestalt psychology. What are the contributions made by Solomon Asch in the field of psychology? Solomon Asch is considered a pioneer of social psychology and Gestalt psychology. His conformity experiments demonstrated the power of social influence and still serve as a source of inspiration for social psychology researchers today. Understanding why people conform and under what circumstances they will go against their own convictions to fit in with the crowd not only helps psychologists understand when conformity is likely to occur, but also what can be done to prevent it. Asch also supervised Stanley Milgram's PhD at Harvard University and inspired Milgram's own highly influential research on obedience. Milgram's work helped demonstrate how far people would go to obey an order from an authority figure. While Asch's work illustrated how peer pressure influences social behavior, often in negative ways, Asch still believed that people tended to behave decently towards each other. The power of situations in group pressure, however, could often lead to less than ideal behavior and decision making. Awards and accomplishments of Solomon Asch. Solomon Asch had been the fellow of the Guggenheim Foundation for 2 consecutive years from 1941 to 1944. He was also the member of the Institute for Advanced Study from 1958 to 1960 and in 1970 as well. He had also been a senior fellow of the U.S. Public Health Service from 1959 to 1960. He was awarded the Nicholas Murray Butler Medal from Columbia University in 1962. He had been a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1965 and the Fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences from 1976 to 1977. He also received the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association in 1967. So, after learning about contributions, awards, and accomplishments of Solomon Asch, let's find out why are we even studying about his line experiment. Let's dig out more. Many of the problems of a teenager's life revolve around the inherent need to fit in, to conform and find one's place where the survival needs of belongingness, security, and support are met. This urge to conform is what is called in layman terms peer pressure. The pressure which leads many young men and women to drug and alcohol abuse and delinquency. So, to learn why we conform and how to reduce this conformity, we turn to Solomon Asch and his groundbreaking line experiments on conformity. We must also keep in mind that peer pressure not only instills the individual with negative behavior but can unleash the positive side as well. Now let's move on to Asch line experiment. In his famous line experiment, Asch showed his subjects a picture of a vertical line followed by 3 lines of different lengths, one of which was obviously the same length as the first one. He then asked the subjects to identify which line was the same length as the first one. Solomon Asch used 123 male college students as his subjects and told them that his experiment was simply a vision test. Each participant was placed in a room with 5 to 7 Confederates. The group was then gathered in a classroom and shown 2 cards. The group was first shown a card with a line on it, then they were shown a second card with 3 lines labeled A, B, and C. Each person was then asked to choose which line on the second card matched the line on the first card. The group was manipulated in such a way that the Confederates respond first, leaving the actual participant to respond at last. During the first 2 rounds, all the Confederates answered correctly, and this helped to put the actual participant at ease. However, after the 4th round, the Confederates began responding with a clearly wrong answer. For the next 12 rounds, also known as the critical trials, all the Confederates gave these wrong answers loudly and confidently. Asch then waited to see if participant would conform to group pressure by giving the same incorrect answers as the Confederates. Now, let's try to understand the result of the experiment. The results of the experiment showed that 25% of participants were able to withstand all forms of group pressure and give the correct answer in each trial. However, 75% of participants conformed to group pressure at least once. In the control group, less than 1% of participants answered incorrectly. After the experiment, some of the participants explained that they did not want to stand out or be ridiculed for their answers. Other participants said they actually thought the majority view was correct. Although they could see the correct answer, they convinced themselves that perhaps the line was just a little too short, and so they went with the group's answer. Asch concluded that there are 3 reasons that people conform. First, distortion of judgment. This was the most common outcome where subjects assumed that their individual answers were incorrect after seeing the rest of the group answer differently. So they changed their answer to align with the group. Second, distortion of action. These subjects never doubted that they were correct and the group was wrong, but out of fear of being perceived as different, they suppressed their opinions and intentionally lied when it was their turn to give an answer. Third, distortion of perception due to the stress of group pressure. This group of subjects always agreed with the group and said during the interview that they wholeheartedly believed that their obviously incorrect answers were correct. Asch concluded that the stress of group pressure had distorted their perception. Asch found that conformity was more likely to occur if there were 3 or more Confederates who all gave the same wrong answer. However, if one Confederate gave the correct answer while the other Confederates answered incorrectly, the participant was much less likely to conform. In later experiments, Asch showed that conformity increases when the task at hand is more difficult, the other members of the group have a higher social status, or the participant is asked to respond publicly. Now, after studying about the line experiment, let's understand the applications of Asch's theory. Social conformity is found in many aspects of everyday life. Civilized society is built upon people's willingness to conform to certain rules or standards that help to maintain order and promote progress. For example, people conform to social standards of wearing clothes in public and driving in a particular lane on the road. Other everyday examples that we can observe around us are the residents who display politically art signs may influence other residents in their community to vote for a specific political party. Companies may increase sales by using stats to show that most people in the neighborhood are using a specific product or service. People who want to improve their health may be encouraged to surround themselves with individuals who have healthy habits such as exercising regularly and eating a healthy diet. With every experiment, criticisms arise. Now let's understand the criticisms of Solomon Asch's line experiment. One big issue with the Asch line study is that the subjects were all white male college students between the ages of 17 and 25 with the mean age of 20. Since the experiment only shows results for this small and specific group of people, it alone cannot be applied to other groups such as women or older men. Experimenter bias. Researchers can use one demographic if they are specifically studying that demographic. But Asch was not just looking at young white men. If he had expanded his research to include more participants, he may have produced different answers. He chose subjects from one demographic, which is a form of experiment bias. We assume that he did not go about his study with the intention of being biased. Even the way that we share information about psychology research is the result of bias. One question that arises here is the Asch line study ethnocentric? Some critics have claimed that Asch's experiments say more about American culture than conformity. Studies conducted in other countries show that the level of conformity may change depending on whether a country prioritizes individualism or collectivism. Another most significant question that arises here is that does the Asch line study stand the test of time? Well, not exactly. Young white men in the early 1950s may have responded differently to this experiment than young white men would today. In the United States, which is where this experiment was performed, the mid-1950s was a historic turning point in terms of rejecting conformity. Youth were pushing towards a more free-thinking society. This experiment was performed right around the time that the movement was just starting to blossom. So the subjects had not grown up in the middle of this anti-new conformist movement. Had Asch performed this experiment a decade later with youth who more highly valued free thinking, he may have come across very different results. Another thing to note is that, at least in the United States, education has evolved with this movement of encouraging free thinking. Teachers today tell students to question everything, and many schools reject ideas of conformity. This could once again mean that, if done again today, Asch would have found very different results with this experiment. Another problem with this experiment is that, since subjects were not told it was a psychological experiment until after it was over, subjects may have gone through emotional and psychological pain during what they thought was just a simple vision test. Finally, it's good to remember that the Asch line experiment is just that, an experiment where people looked at lines. This can be hard to apply to other situations because humans in group settings are rarely faced with such questions that have one such obvious and clear answer, as was the case in this experiment.